Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I worship Your holy name. You're rich in love and You're slow to anger. Your name is great and Your heart is kind. For all Your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to find. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I worship Your holy name. And on that day when my strength is failing, the angel's near and my time has come, and still my soul will sing Your praise unending. 10,000 years and then forevermore. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I worship Your holy name. Bless the Lord. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I worship Your holy name. Yes, I worship Your holy name. Lord, I worship Your holy name.
Please be seated. Thank you very much, Citrine, Daphne, and Marianne. On April 10th, Oasis is going to visit the Lightened Shadows Caravaggio exhibit and hear a private lecture by art expert and chairwoman of the Hong Kong Museum of Art, Nancy Lee, in front of Caravaggio's early 17th century masterpiece, The Supper at Emmaus. Nancy is here to give us a brief 10 minutes on sort of a teaser or a preview of what we will see on this trip April 10th, which is a Thursday night. So 8 to 9, April 10th. Mark that in your calendar, and please RSVP if you would like to come. So Nancy, I'll invite you up.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm very honored to be here, and I realize what a big subject Caravaggio is. And some of you may have heard that his beautiful painting is at the Asia Society. I hope you'll come April 10th because it's such an exciting painting. And if you know more about him, you will find him even more amazing because he is not just a fantastic painter, but also he struggled all his life as a sinner. And you see through his paintings his search for divine love and repentance and grace. And so they're very, very moving canvases, and how he expresses them I think will speak to all of us when we see it. And tonight, I realize time is so tight, I may have to sort of breeze through. Either I can tell you more about him, or I can show you more about his works, and I will struggle a bit with time, I think. Could I have the first slide, please? This is a portrait of Caravaggio done posthumously, after he had died. He was born Michelangelo Merisi, and born in the town of Caravaggio, but when he became so famous, people simply knew him as Caravaggio. His birth date is in 1571. By the time he died, he was only 39 years old, but he had revolutionized the way paintings were done. And for that, you have to understand a little bit the background of painting at that time. Europe had gone through the high Renaissance, and if you know the works of Leonardo da Vinci, you know the works of Michelangelo, you can imagine Raphael. So Raphael was considered the height of Renaissance art, and he painted these serene, beautiful, sort of Holy Family paintings of the Virgin Mary with a baby, sometimes with St. John the Baptist, all in sort of a landscape that was heavenly. And you almost could hear the angels singing when you looked at these paintings. So that was considered the height of art. But gradually, it changed. It started to change. People painted in a manner that we now call mannerist, because it was very mannered, and the figures would be elongated. The colors became almost acidic, and they were trying always to change the way to express the feelings of the time. So this is the background of when Caravaggio comes in from the provinces and through Milan, and he comes trained from a background that paints much darker. So in Rome, all the paintings were very sort of light and frothy. And here comes Caravaggio with his solid paintings. He learned to paint from nature, meaning he studied things very carefully, how they actually looked. His early paintings looked like botanical paintings. Could I have the next slide, please? And this is when he was an apprentice in the first workshop. And he did this painting, which was done for commercial purposes. A young man holding a basket of fruit. The real beauty of that painting is in the basket of fruit. The young man, he's a bit slightly awkward. His shoulder doesn't fit, his arm doesn't fit his shoulder, and he looks quite androgynous. But there was a market for these paintings, and very often people, even cardinals, would buy paintings that had very non-religious nature, and would hang them in their galleries. So next painting. Here he paints Bacchus drunk and sickly. So he has a sickly coloring. They call him actually, yes, sickly Bacchus. And it's thought that this is actually a portrait, self-portrait of Caravaggio painted using a mirror. And the reason for that is somehow the painting doesn't quite fit the space. It's awkward. But many things start to emerge. He was known for still lifes, so he puts the still life on a table in front of you. He pushes your viewpoint straight at the person. He doesn't observe them from far away. All the scenes of that time were observed from far away, very detached, but he comes very close to his subject. So you feel emotionally connected to this person. And always he's perfecting the shoulder, how he is holding those grapes. Bacchus was a god of wine, as you know. Okay, next slide. And now, very soon after, he's done another Bacchus. And you see he has perfected the arm and the shoulder and all the glorious fruits. He's observed different stages of decay in the fruits. And he has painted him in quite a feminine sort of way, as a soft person, because Bacchus drank all his life, he did nothing, he had an easy life. So he's portrayed in a reclining position that recalls classical scenes from Rome. And so this is very much, and also he doesn't show him full length. It's a half-length portrait, typical in the Lombardy pictorial convention of a mythological scene, and this tradition comes from Leonardo da Vinci. Next slide, please. This is the penitent Magdalene. And he, unlike Magdalene of those times, they were usually painted with their eyes looking up to heaven, tears streaming out the face. They look very ethereal. This Magdalene sits with a classical pose of melancholia. And in Counter-Reformation Catholicism, Mary Magdalene was promoted as an attractive, persuasive model of repentance and reform. So here she's shown with all her earthly vanities, but she has thrown away her jewels in one corner. He is at the moment of reflection, when she realizes she's led a life of vanity and he is repenting for it. It's a moment of true conversion. She will eventually be glorified as a mystic bride of Christ. Now, there were always questions about female models in Caravaggio paintings because women of that time didn't pose. They would not, any decent woman would not pose in front of an artist. So it was always rumored that he used prostitutes as models, which really infuriated people who were very strict. Next slide, please. And this is not a very good slide, but it shows the rest on the flight to Egypt, and this is done in 1594. There's a large angel separating two distinct background landscapes, and on the left you have the Virgin Mary cradling baby Jesus in a really warm embrace, surrounded by this sort of heavenly landscape. And on the other side is Joseph, and Joseph is taking care of all the earthly chores. You know, he's got the baggage, the food, the donkey, and he's holding the music for the angel. And you can actually, that score actually belongs to a real music. And it was very a piece of the time. And it was very common for people to have these musical gatherings in the countryside. So it makes reference to that also. And the sweetness of the expression in the scene, the lyricism, gradually Caravaggio will move away from that. Next slide. In 1594, a little bit later, he starts painting the series based on life of that time, and this one is called The Fortune Teller, and he invents this genre showing foppishly dressed young men being cheated by exotic and seductive gypsies. So she is reading his palm, and while she's reading his palm, she's slipping the ring off his hand. So this painting was so popular that there were many actually copies made, even by Caravaggio himself, because everyone wanted to have one. He was very careful to guard his secrets of his painting techniques, so he never had a workshop. He didn't produce in large quantities. Next slide. So here is in the same genre. It's called Card Sharps, and another young man is about to be cheated playing cards, and he puts us right up against the action. There's a table that you see and a backgammon board that juts out into our space. When you are looking at the painting, it's as if you've walked into this scene. And the two accomplices, the one in the back and the one with his back to us, he's pulling some cards out of the back of his outfit, and he's got a dagger ready in case things go wrong. He's going to stab you. So anyway, but Caravaggio somehow elevates the subject above the grotesque, because a lot of Netherlandish painters painted this sort of scenery and they made them ugly and grotesque. Instead, you sort of come to mind of the parable of the prodigal son. There he is, the prodigal son, wasting his time and all his finances. He has cut all the unnecessary detail from the painting, so the background is just a blur of light and shadow. He begins to use light as a unifying, sort of the unifying light that brings all these figures together. Next slide. This is, again, he was very well known for still lifes, and this is the only one he really painted only as a still life, but he has made such a humble subject look like a monumental sort of presence. He draws each fruit and leaf carefully, like a botanical illustration. He observed nature very closely, and it's almost like watching a historic painting. Next slide. Now, he starts to paint more complex canvases, and this one is Judith beheading Holofernes, done in 1598. And here he combines terror, affect, and contrast. Judith is a beautiful widow who seduces the Assyrian general Holofernes, whose army is besieging her hometown. So overcome with drink, Holofernes passes out and is decapitated by Judith. So this scene had never been shown before in this way. Actually had never been depicted before. The pose of Holofernes alludes to the famous sculpture of Laocoon. Judith is based on the classical Amazon, and the old woman resembles caricatures that were made by Leonardo da Vinci. So here you see a juxtaposition of the old and the young, the determination and the revulsion on the face of Judith, and the atrocity, in fact, is seen as an effective means of promoting piety and conversion. Next slide. This is the most famous first altarpiece done by Caravaggio, and it was for the Contarelli Chapel, and it's the life cycle of St. Matthew, painted in 1599. Now this painting is in black and white because it was actually in Berlin, and in 1945 it disappeared, and no one has seen it since. We don't know whether it's in Russia or it was destroyed. But it shows the first major public commission for an altar and side panels dedicated to St. Matthew, and it shows a lot of erudite theological content that people sometimes didn't understand and therefore attacked. St. Matthew is seated with a book, writing on, or wanting to write, and being guided by a standing angel. He's shown barefoot and muscular, and exemplifying the poverty of apostles. The features of St. Matthew resemble Socrates, who was well known as a pre-Christian example of blessed ignorance, who was apparently illiterate but very, very clever. He needed divine wisdom, and eventually this painting was rejected. They just felt people were offended by the humility of that apostle. They just thought he wasn't sophisticated enough. So, next slide. At about the same time, he completed the martyrdom of St. Matthew. And here you see a canvas full of action, many characters, very complex. And he confronted the problem of composing large history paintings with numerous full-length figures. And the legend was that the apostle was doing missionary work in Ethiopia when he was murdered while celebrating Mass. So Caravaggio shows the moment of the first attack rather than the moment of martyrdom. And you see a range of reactions in the people around, from the boy who was panicked and running off to the right, and that figure he copies from Titian. Then you have two figures in the front. They're just sitting there looking. They're voyeurs. There's something horrific happening, I want to see it. And then the figures in the front on the left, they're in shock and horror. And then two standing figures actually show total indifference. And then at the very back, you see a little head of somebody looking in, and if you can have a close-up of it, you would see that that figure is actually Caravaggio, and his face is full of pity and compassion. So he has painted himself into the scene. And St. Matthew is not showing terror. He's reaching out, in fact, to a pawn held by an angel who's hanging down from a cloud. He's accepting his martyrdom. And his executioner, who supposedly is a soldier, he didn't give him an outfit. He just painted him in a nude. So a classical reference. Next slide. This is one of the most wonderful paintings by Caravaggio called The Calling of St. Matthew. And Matthew here and I were discussing it. It's so wonderful. It was painted in 1600. And Christ summons the tax collector, Levi, so Matthew Levi, to follow him. Christ and Peter are entering the scene from the right. And I'm sorry, it's a bit cropped. The profile of Christ, can barely see, but what you really see is that arm stretched out. And he has used the light and shadow to make that hand stand out on its own. And this sort of gesture comes directly from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, the creation of Adam, when God reaches out and Adam is coming to life. So it's that gesture. It's not a commanding gesture. It's a gesture to bring you to conversion through mercy and materialized in a diagonal beam of light. And Matthew is the bearded man with a hat, and he's pointing at himself saying, me? Who? Who me? And next to him are his co-workers, and one of them is the one in the foreground. You see him bent over the table. He's counting his coins. So the entire space is electrified by the light. He now uses light extremely effectively to add emotional content to the subject. Next. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Geraldine, would you go back to the calling of St. Matthew? Because my name is Matthew, I have a special affinity to this painting. And when each of us read the Bible, we have to imagine the scene in our heads. And I think it's a gift when someone has the artistic genius of Caravaggio. He's imagining a biblical scene for us. And in this scene, I've always thought it's so precious that Matthew is a little surprised. Are you calling me? Really? And the people around Matthew are so absorbed in what they're doing, they miss the call altogether. They don't even recognize it's a moment that's happening. Now, I don't want this to be the martyrdom of Matthew and for interrupting you, but we do, I want to save some slides for the lecture, and because then people will be lazy and not come to the lecture. So to hear the rest of this, and to hear kind of the climactic piece, which is the Supper at Emmaus, to hear Nancy speak on that, come April 10th, 8 to 9 to the Asia Society. So Nancy, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Nancy. Okay, I'd like to introduce our panelists for tonight. First, and after I introduce them, I'll call them up. First, Roy Wong is the alternate CEO of China CITIC Bank. Roy studied history at UC Berkeley, earned his JD from Georgetown Law School, and has 30 years of experience in the field. Alia Iris is currently CEO of Mother's Choice, a nonprofit that has provided crisis pregnancy care for 51,000 young women and girls and facilitated 1,400 adoptions. She formerly worked as a corporate lawyer for Hogan Lovells in Hong Kong, in Skadden Arps in NYC, and holds her JD also from Georgetown Law. Kay Ian is a leading corporate lawyer in Hong Kong for Sullivan & Cromwell. He specializes in capital markets and mergers and acquisitions. Kay Ian has advised on 40 completed Hong Kong IPOs, raising more than US $70 billion in aggregate. So it's an honor to have the three of you here. I'd like to invite you to come up. Now, how this is going to work is I'm going to pose a question just to get them going, but then they're going to pose a question to you, the audience, and I'll run around with the mic, and so if you would speak into the mic, we'd like several people to answer the question. Then after that, it'll be a free-for-all. So anyone who would like to ask a question may. So, by way of introduction, at what age did you enter corporate law? Why law and why corporate law? And did you ever think about leaving? Did you leave, or why did you stay? Okay, so why corporate law? Roy, we'll start with you, and I'll give this mic.
Okay. Very quickly, thank you, Matthew, for having us here. It's really great to be part of this finally. I've heard so much about Oasis and the group here, and it's really wonderful to see everyone here tonight. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm supposed to whiz through those questions. The question is, why law? in the first place. And I really distinctly remember thinking this through. I thought that law was something that provided you knowledge and tools that were really cool, because you can use that knowledge and tools on behalf of others. And I've always thought about law in terms of litigation, courtrooms, and this is really typical for people growing up in the United States, because they're so full, it's all about litigation. And so, in fact, I started out in litigation, and then I chose corporate law, not so much. Actually, that's the wrong way to describe it. I didn't choose corporate law. I followed my wife out to Hong Kong because of her opportunities. And a U.S.-trained litigator has no place in Hong Kong courts, so I had to change to corporate law, and so that's how I ended up there. But then I went back to the United States after I married her. At the time we came out, she wasn't my wife, but then we went back and we were married, and I went back to litigation and did that for another 6 years. But then Virginia got another call back to Hong Kong, and so I followed her out again, and I came and have been here since and been doing corporate law since.
I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and I didn't actually know too many lawyers, so I didn't have this, I wasn't a young child thinking I want to be a lawyer. I actually took 2 years out before I went to college in the U.S. to do overseas missionary work with Youth of the Mission. And when I finished, my time with them, I felt like I had a calling, and I didn't know how to define it other than I wanted to be an ambassador. And I'm not saying I want to be, not necessarily being an ambassador for a country, but something I felt really passionate about was being able to facilitate communication and relationship with parties who have different cultures or don't understand each other and maybe in conflict. And so my first week in college, I went to this pre-law seminar with the dean from the law school at George Washington University, and he looked at this room full of freshman college students, and he said, all of you in here think you want to go to law school after college. Well, none of you are going to make it. It's too hard. You think being a lawyer is something amazing. Well, it isn't. So just get over it. And so I was like, oh, wow, okay, well, I don't want to have anything to do with people like him. So I forgot about it, and I was studying international affairs. And before my senior year, I went to go do a program with the Institute for International Mediation and Conflict Resolution in The Hague. And there were all these incredible speakers who were peace negotiators or, even wartime journalists and, representatives in the EU and the UN. And I tried to talk to as many of them as I could after all these projects that we were doing with these international organizations. And the most amazing thing that struck me was every single one of them had a law degree. And I thought, okay, I'm back on track. I'm going to apply for law school. So I applied to law school. I went to Georgetown, and I was also in a special program there for international law, and very quickly realized that if I want to have a global career, an international career, litigation is not the right path for me. So I decided in my first year of law school I was going to focus on getting jobs with international law firms. So my first summer associate position was with Freshfields in Beijing. And then I went to Skadden Arps in New York. And that's after talking to lawyers here. When I came back home to Hong Kong for holidays, I said, should I just try and start my career here? And they said, well, since you're a U.S. trained lawyer, maybe get a few years experience in New York. So I did M&A and corporate finance at Skadden Arps. And then when I moved back to Hong Kong, I joined Hogan Lovells, also in their corporate law department. So, and I was a corporate lawyer until exactly 2 years ago, this week. And I truly still believe that the law is the infrastructure of our society. And even though I'm no longer a lawyer, and I guess we'll share more about this later, my corporate law experience and law school have been absolutely invaluable to me, even in running a nonprofit.
For me, why I became a lawyer was actually because there was a very personal experience that happened. My parents owned a business, and at the time that they owned the business, they entered into a particular contract whereby they would have, it was a commercial contract, and it went very badly. And at the end of it, and there was many years of litigation over the commercial contract on the corporate structure. I wouldn't go into details.